So I've got to record this quick since I've got to join a producer call very soon. But last night I made this sample and I was really annoyed that I wasn't recording because it turned out so beautiful and so simple. And it was such a great reminder to me that you don't need much to make great and amazing, beautiful samples. It was just such a great reminder that you don't need tons of layers or textures to make great and beautiful samples. So I'm going to show you quickly exactly how I made this sample. I'm going to play you the intro and then I'm going to go through each layer, each plugin, VST, etc. that I used. So let's get into it. So starting out, this is the intro. So this sample just has such a feeling of nostalgia to me. It's kind of melancholic, but it just feels nostalgic and almost like I'm thinking about the past. And I can tell you exactly which layer is doing that. So how I even went about making this sample was I went on Google. I think I searched dark, jazzy chords because I wanted to try something new and just get out of the same habits and chords that I've been using. So I came across this one. All I did was just kind of strum the notes. I can't remember the exact chord, but basically I put this on a piano and I'll show you which piano I used. But this was the chord. Also, I'm going to take off the sound shift on my master, which I just pitched this whole project down 4 semitones. So that was the chord that I started with, and all I did was just kind of strum it like this. And this is from the Neufeld Bank in Contact, and this is the filling gaps felt, which I think is in the particles section. Yeah, I didn't mess with any of the effects or any of the knobs on there. I just left it as it is. And when I play this, you'll hear that there's just some slight artifacts and textures that this preset just already has, and I really like the way it sounded. So all I then did was just add a little bit of the stock Logic compressor, and then I added a little bit of halftime just with almost like a 50%, not mix, but like where the band is. So it's only applying halftime to the upper frequencies or the higher end of the frequencies, and this is what it sounds like. And I just pitched it up an octave. So you can do this with pretty much any chord. If you just take a chord and then kind of move each note so that it's like a strum, or, you know, kind of, it gives it this very, and obviously it's the chord itself that sounds, I guess, kind of nostalgic, but it just really adds to that kind of ethereal sound. So I really liked how that sounded and came out. So I bounced that out, and then all I did was sound shifted it up 4, which again, keep in mind, I ended up sound shifting the whole project down 4, so it ended up staying the same. But even just pitching it up and then down would have introduced some kind of like artifacts and just a bit of a distorted, vintagey sound, because it's always going to kind of slightly mess up the audio, but in like a good way, in a way that I think sounds good in samples because it's less perfect sounding. I also just want to specify that none of these notes were precisely on the grid. All I did within Logic was just go on MIDI transform and then humanize, and then I clicked that a couple times just so all the notes were slightly different velocity or like loudness or volume, and then just kind of move them slightly off the grid. So that also added to the imperfection and gave it more of a human feel. So I pitched it up. I added some of this UAD compressor. This has been my go-to compressor now for a while. Added multi-band compression, and this was just really ducking those more muddy frequencies that I was finding and boosting the highs. Because I had also pitched the sample down quite a bit, it was sitting a lot in that low end and the low mids, which can tend to be muddier sounding. So just kind of bringing more shine and brightness to the high end, especially because it's kind of a, it's very, I don't know what the word is, but you know what I mean? It's just like twinkling a lot in the high end. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that and added a little bit more compression. This is just another UAD compressor, the Rev E. And then I just EQ'd again some of the more like muddy frequencies I was finding and cutting out some of the low end. So that was the piano, which is the main thing. And if there's one instrument or two that I can think of that really give me a kind of melancholic, nostalgic, like thinking about the past kind of feeling, I would say it's saxophone and probably like a trumpet. So I just didn't really have any like saxophone samples or phrases in any of the multi-kits or banks that I had currently. So I went to Splice, don't shoot me, and I found this one sample with this saxophone, which I think originally sounded like this. I'll take off all the plugins. Keep in mind I've also time stretched this, so this is what it sounded like. So you can hear I did chop it up a bit, not too much, but enough, I think, to just make it at least a bit more original. And also, obviously, I kept it short. So I sound shifted it up one just so it matched the project. I added quite a bit of EQ on this Pultec, just cutting out up to 750 hertz. I added the multi-band compressor, just ducking where a lot of the piano was sitting, and same with a lot of the other sounds. It's quite a low mid focused sample, so just trying to clean things up and give everything their own space. Added a bunch of compression. I added RC20, and here you can see I brought the width like super kind of mono and close sounding. And that, I think, just added to the kind of the sonics being more kind of intimate and close, considering a lot of the other elements are quite like washed and reverbed and have a lot of delay, like the vocals and stuff, which come in later. So keeping this kind of the opposite, very close, adding some of that vinyl crackle, a bit of distortion. And then I added some tape delay, which I didn't do a super high mix, but just enough to kind of, again, give it more of a very atmospheric, kind of washed, nostalgic 80s feeling, I guess. Added a bunch of EQ, cutting out a lot of the mids here. You can see specifically I've like boosted the sides here, and this is just with the stereo placement. So this can make a big difference, because one thing I was finding, and I'll just show you, I just added this last little bit of multi-band compression, but I was finding that with this sample, the biggest challenge was just the mix, because a lot of these sounds, and there's not a lot of sounds, but most of them are kind of in a very similar frequency range. There's not a lot of like super high-end material or like a bassy low end. So it's all kind of very mid-focused, which means although I didn't have a lot of tracks, it meant just having everything kind of sit nicely together. And especially when you're using a lot of like delay and reverbs and stuff, it's easy for things to muddy up and sound very washed out. So yeah, that's the reason for a lot of that EQing and multi-band compression. And yeah, I just liked how it sat, so. And then I have this texture, which is one I've actually made, but it sounds like this. And without anything on it. So all I did was sound shifted it so it matched the project, and added a little bit of compression, added the Pultec EQ, cutting out a lot of the lows, and then I added some delay, so that added to the kind of the dreaminess, the washed out kind of tail feeling that it gave it, and then just EQing out the lows again, and even more lows in the piano, just so there was still more separation happening. And then I have this percussive loop from Mafio. I think it's the Agency multi-kit, and I just pitched it up 3 and added some of the DH flanger, which I almost always use on my percussive elements, and the flanger is obviously just giving it a kind of phasey, swooshy effect, which I liked, and also widening it. And then I added some EQ, so it's just giving it a bit of rhythm, but it's tucked in nicely and it's not taking up a bunch of space. There's obviously still a lot of space for a producer to add drums to this. And really the other texture I think is always so important, especially in these kinds of samples, is just some background atmosphere. And usually I find myself just using vinyl crackles, so I just got this from Splice and I just EQ'd out a lot of the lows, added another EQ, weird curve, but so yeah, you'd be surprised how much of a difference just having some white noise or pink noise, brown noise, any kind of like atmosphere or just nature type of sound can really add like a liveliness and add a rawness and human feel to your samples. And that's something I find myself doing a lot more these days, especially with the more ambient and atmospheric samples. Obviously, it depends on the genre you're trying to do. If you're trying to do some kind of like crazy hyper pop or like trippy red type, there's certain artists that you're probably not going to need to focus so much on like detailed like textures and ambiances, but it's just the kind of stuff I like to make. So, and then into the next section, we're introducing the vocal as well as like this tonal percussive element, which I'm going to show you how I made it because I just think it sounds so awesome. Here we go. So this vocal was from Splice, and as you can see here, I used a disgusting amount of plugins on this, probably unnecessarily so, but it was just kind of like I would do one thing and I liked it, and then I wanted to add another, and I just kind of kept following that path until I hit a point where I was like, okay, I'm satisfied with it. So not saying you need to add this many plugins to your sounds. Normally, if you have good sound selection, you shouldn't need too many plugins, but initially this vocal, let me see if I can duplicate this. Hopefully it just doesn't completely lag out. So I think this was the sample. I'm going to take off all these plugins, and it sounded like this. So I have time stretched this. So I have slightly time stretched that vocal, so that also just made it sound a little bit different. But yeah, I just got that from Splice, and something I've really kind of found, even just the last few days, the last week now, is I've had a lot more freedom or been a lot more forgiving to myself for using something like Splice. There's such a stigma in the sample making or producer community to use something like Splice, and I understand it, because you could argue, oh well, it's cheating, it's lazy, if you're just taking a bunch of sounds and throwing them together and you don't really do as much work. And then I think also you do have the legal side of things where, although they're meant to be royalty-free sounds, there are people out there who have taken those sounds and put like content ID or claimed it as their own, so then other people get flagged for copyright when using those same royalty-free sounds. So Splice is a bit of a gray area at this point, I feel like, but I think it's still important to firstly just have fun making music, and then also I will always try and chop up those samples so that they don't sound like the original. Sometimes I'll do drastic chops so it sounds nothing, like it's almost unrecognizable, and sometimes they're just more subtle or like background pieces where I don't do too much. But the main thing is I just want to make amazing music and I want to make amazing samples, and I don't use Splice that often. But recently I kind of thought, you know what, why not? Because I feel like it's a bit of an ego thing to not use it and just be like, oh, I made everything from scratch. And I just don't see the point in that. Anyway, I don't want to make this a long-winded argument about whether you should or shouldn't use Splice, but there is quite a bit of stigma when it comes to it. And I just said, screw that. I'm making a dope-ass sample. So I chopped up that vocal and I sound shifted it up 7. I added the UAD compressor, I added Little Alter Boy, which I just pitched the formant down a little bit. All this is doing is making it sound kind of a bit deeper and lower, even though it's still in the same key. So Little Alter Boy is an awesome plugin for vocals. And then I added a bunch of reverb, EQing out quite a bit of the lows up to 500. And then I added delay, and this is just the stock Logic delay. I didn't really do anything with it. Added the RVox, which is just like a compressor, and I also love this for vocals, but honestly really anything. It's just a great compressor. And then I added some EQ, cutting out a lot of the highs, a lot of the lows. And then added the Pultec EQ, cutting out up to 1000 hertz, so a lot of the low end as well. And another reason I also added another EQ, and the Pultec one in particular, is I just love the sound that this EQ gives. One thing I want to do more with time, and I think we should all do as producers, is experiment with the sound and flavor or taste of different plugins, if you will, because every EQ, every compressor, etc. has its own kind of sound to it, and again, flavor, if you will. And I really like this Pultec EQ, so that's what I used. I added this noise gate, which, to be honest, I don't have a lot of experience with noise gates. I had just been watching the My Studio Audio Nerds. I think they changed their name, podcast, and they were talking about noise gating on vocals, and I don't know. I just slapped it on there. I don't even know if it's really doing much, to be honest. If you guys know much about noise gating, then just comment below. And then I added a bunch more compression as well, again on the Rev E compressor this time. So altogether it sounds like this. Sounds like something from the 70s or 80s. Yeah, I just really like that chop. So the next element is this percussive kind of tonal sound that I have. And this is from Beat Center. And without anything on it, it sounds like this. Keep in mind, I've also time stretched this. And these were both from the same sound. So let me see. Yeah, I think it was this. So that was what it was originally. And then I chopped that, and both these layers, that same sound, just chopped, and then just sound shifting it, pitching it up a full octave, adding more compression, adding some halftime, and I put this on the 8th note setting because I liked how it sounded, but then I didn't like it on this one. So on this lower layer, you can see I've added all the same plugins, but the halftime's on half as opposed to a quarter note or an 8th or 1 bar. It's on a half because it just hit a lot nicer. It wasn't giving me the stutter effect that the other one was doing. And then I just added delay to both of them. So they're pretty much exactly the same, but they sound like this. I love that it's giving it a rhythmic drive, but it's also tonal, like melodic sounding. And I think that just adds a lot to this because it is just a very melodic and kind of sensual sounding sample, if you will. And I think that just really added to it. So yeah, and then just leaving this little gap where it gives it a nice little bit of space to breathe before coming back in with that saxophone. And I just included a bit longer of a chop and kind of section of this original sample. So yeah, this is what it sounds like. So you can see I've taken a longer section and chop of the saxophone sample. And then into the outro. Oof, I love those little percussive textures. And one thing you might have noticed, which is a little trick I literally just took from a video yesterday before I made the sample, was although I usually add the kind of ambient sounds, the vinyl crackles and textures and nature sounds, I think just doing this was one thing I learned, and I wish I remembered who spoke about it because I'd give them credit, but just adding these fades and like chops on the vinyl crackle, so even that sounds more human, just made it sound more real. So that's something I think I'll definitely be doing a lot more. And all I did on the master was just sound shifted it back down 4 semitones, and I added this multi-band compressor, which you can see in the high end I've used the expand setting just to kind of widen it and give it more shine, and a little bit more of the expand setting here, and just boosting some of the low end and just or like compressing it especially. Added some EQ, just making some simple ducks and boosts, and yeah, and then the ARTG mastering plugin by Wave Switch. I love this one. This is kind of my default like preset that I use, and yeah, just bringing it a bit more kind of narrow mono sounding, as you can see with these 2 knobs here. And last but not least, I always add just a limiter just to make sure I'm not clipping, and I keep it at minus 0.2 decibels. So yeah, guys, I love how this sample turned out. It was a super simple one, and it was just one of those where I just started flowing, and it was a nice, new, refreshing kind of nostalgic sound that I hadn't been making in a lot of my recent samples. Unfortunately, I wasn't recording, but I just knew, I was like, I have to make a breakdown video of this. So I love the simplicity, and just each sound serves its purpose. And if you want to download this exact sample as well as many, many more, including phrases, textures, accents, all the stuff I've made this year onwards, then just click the link below. You'll have full access to them. And until then, hopefully I'll see you in the next one, guys. Peace.